I thought it was going to be. That's nice, isn't it? So let us begin. As we have been doing with all of our sessions this week, as part of the tips, tricks and takeaways for the Decolonising DMU project, I just wanted to begin by drawing your attention to our No Space for Hate initiative. So this is our commitment as an institution to challenging inappropriate behaviours and providing practical support and advice for students who are victims, survivors and witnesses to hate and harassment. Please do take some time to take a look at the website, and for those of you who work with students, to have that kind of as a thing that you can signpost to them. So in this morning's session, on the last day of our week of events, we are here to talk about the Research Centres and Institutes self-audit tool, which is a part of our Decolonising DMU toolkit. I would like to begin by saying that I didn't work on this at all. I was off having a baby and our very wonderful colleague, Paris Connolly, was in my place covering my maternity leave. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us today, but myself and my colleague Richard, who did do work on this, will be sharing some of the process. So I'm going to give a brief overview of our work as the research portion of our project, and then Richard's going to talk over the specific work that we've done with the research centres and the development of the audit tool, and then we have time for some questions and an opportunity to engage in a little bit of an activity. So I will jump straight in. Apologies, I lost my voice at the beginning of the week and it's just starting to come back a bit, but it's a bit peaky. So if I go a bit in and out, I apologise. The Decolonising DMU project, in its first phase, we worked around the institution, staff, students, library and learning services and research were our kind of 5 core areas of focus. And we are now embarking upon a new phase of work under 4 work streams. And one of the particularly nice parts of that is that research has been brought more into the work that we're doing rather than a kind of separate piece of work. So we have equity in education and research, so looking at our teaching, learning and research practices. We have progression, talent and representation, looking at staff development and representation and recruitment. Raising awareness, changing cultures and behaviours, so looking at providing a safe environment for talking around race and racism, and governance and accountability, so looking at our structures and our policies and practices through an anti-racist lens. And through every step of the process of the project, we have focused upon evaluation and research. So I came into the project in 2018. As part of Freedom to Achieve, before we became Decolonising DMU, in order to evaluate the impact that we make. And that's very much been, up until the last couple of years, that's been the core activity of our research work, is looking at the impact that Decolonising DMU and before that Freedom to Achieve have on the lived experience of our university community. And as the project has matured and our research work has matured, we have begun to conduct more work around the research environment, looking at our outputs and our impact in terms of the different research centres and institutes in the university, and also to try to generate a deeper understanding of our journey and our process of decolonising and becoming an anti-racist university. Sorry. Particularly over the last year, we've been working to look at how we create a research community at DMU and how we share anti-racist practice and embed that kind of work within our research principles. And in the last year, since I came back from maternity leave, myself and Richard and Paris have all worked on a small-scale study exploring perceptions and understanding of what decolonising means to individuals, so individual interpretations of decolonising of our staff and our students, to see what decolonising means to people at Democracy University. And we're currently in the process of writing that up to share and publish. So in terms of how we conduct research as part of the Decolonising DMU project, we have taken a critical race grounded methodology. I am very much from a grounded theory background, so we don't have a hypothesis about why race is experienced in different ways in the institution. Instead, we go out, it's a very qualitative approach. We speak to people, we listen to their experiences and their narratives, and we use the information that we gather and the stories that we gather to develop theory around experience within DMU. It's also, though, a very mixed methods approach for us, because practically, apologies. I had one been trying to talk lots, might kill me a little bit. Because practically, whilst Richard and I are very interested in individual experience, we do also need to show the impact of the project. And so we need to make use of the data that is generated within the institution around student awarding, around retention and progression, also around staff retention and staff development and their career trajectory. So we have a mix of methods within our work. So the period that we're going to look at today was largely developed through the use of student voice and staff surveys, document analysis around our quality assurance documentation. The team kept personal diaries around our work. We asked a group of students to do the same, and then we have institutional data that has also fed into the work that we have shared so far around the progress of the project. And then we have also been exploring, to what extent decolonising principles have been embedded within DMU. That's the step that we're moving towards now with the evaluation. As we've moved into phase 2 of the project, the phase 1 evaluation has been very much around awareness and initial engagement with the project to see how far the reach of the project has been. And now we're interested in looking more deeply at how decolonising principles are actually being embedded within practice at DMU at every level. So we'll be speaking again with staff and with students about their experiences to uncover how that is actually working in practice across the institution. And then alongside that, we have our small-scale research projects, where we've been looking at the impact of decolonising DMU on the idea of the university and on the lived experiences of our students and staff. Hello. There we go. Hand over to my colleague Richard, who's going to talk a little bit more about the work that we have done in the research environment over the last year.
Hello. In the room, hello.
Hello.
I feel like you're being ignored by us a little bit, you know what I mean? I feel like the hybrid thing forces us a little bit into this space. As Lucy said, we've I guess we were interested in looking at the kind of the research environment but also in relation to kind of outputs and impact, the kind of stuff that we heard about yesterday in terms of the ref. So how what do we already have, I guess, thinking about our stuff that we've got on Dora, stuff that we've got already existing out in other repositories in relation to kind of outputs, what work is already happening or is being triggered to happen in relation to kind of impact and public engagement, in particular engagement with different kind of stakeholder groups, because this work was already happening. It's just that we kind of didn't know much about it, and we kind of had no sense, I guess, really of seeing what themes were cropping up, which might, for instance, connect work around race equality with Athena Swan, or with gender, or with disability, knowing that we'd also done some work previously on universal design for learning, for instance. So were there also intersections that we could look at? So we were very interested, I guess, in looking more broadly at, I guess, starting from a position of looking at EDI in relation to research, but then looking to politicize that a little bit more. I will use that word. I'm not sure whether Lucy would or other members of the team would use that word, but I would use it. Part of that is connected through to a draft working position that was developed relatively early in the Decolonising project, which explicitly sought to connect this idea of the university to issues that were cropping up in relation to critical university studies, critical race and critical feminist approaches to the idea of education and engagement in education, and also the idea of the university, but also looking at some work on ideas around abolition. So some of the work of, for instance, Angela Davies and Dubois on abolition democracy and prison abolition, but thinking about that really in terms of the structures, cultures and practices of institutions like universities, and what might we bring in that might open out those spaces in order that they become, I guess, less constraining for some bodies and some individuals and some groups, and more open and transparent in that way. So we were looking at the kind of we wanted to look at the kind of we were interested in the kind of broader environment, what the lived experiences say and how they speak to the data. And I deliberately talk about the lived experiences and how they speak to and with the data, rather than the data driving the nature of the questions we ask about those lived experiences. So much more relational kind of approach to our engagement with research, and also with individuals who are trying to do research, people who are trying to do scholarship work as well. We were also interested, and this kind of cropped up from some work by Adam Fishwick, who was at the time the faculty head of research students in business and law, who was very interested in the nature of kind of postgraduate research student admissions and transitions. What work were we doing in order to support people in having a voice throughout the kind of the process of admission? So do Black and ethnically minoritized students, for instance, or potential students, feel like they can speak in appropriately understand kind of issues in relation to methodology, theory, bring their own approaches to methodology and theory into interviews, into applications? Do they feel like they can be heard in that space? What do supervisory arrangements look like in that space, for instance? What does student support look like, doctoral training look like in that space that might actually open out a wider range of methodological, theoretical approaches to field work, for instance, data collection, co-creation, all of those issues. So Adam started that work, set up a working group within business and law in order to move that forward. We've had some conversations with Chantal in the doctoral college about running some sessions on research training, and I think that some of those are scoped for next year now in relation to work with doctoral students on research training and elements of decolonising, howsoever that is framed. That might be in relation to diversifying access to resources, but it might be about relationships within supervisory teams, modes of expression, for instance. So one of the things that constantly crops up with me in a lot of my supervisions is, how subjective can I be as a research student? Where is the I in this research project? And that's a hugely important discussion area for us. And we've also done some work for my sins. I'm now the chair of faculty research ethics in health and life sciences, and we're doing some work around ethics there and what those processes look like. In particular, thinking potentially about participative research design, community engagement in research, levels of risk and vulnerability with certain groups, for instance, and methodological development as well. So. The core of this session really is about the kind of the self-audit tool. That emerged. We were doing all of this other work anyway on evaluation, on research. That was emerging over time. We decided to open out our discussions with the kind of the 32 as is. I think it's 32 research institutes and centres, to try to go and work with some friends or some colleagues who had kind of wanted to talk to us about their approach to research, but about trying to really understand what their, what their understanding, what their engagement, what their kind of co-production was at the moment. So we wanted to look at what they were, we wanted to talk to them. We didn't necessarily want to look at, we wanted to talk to them about their engagement with decolonising anti-racist research, in order to look at the potential development of a kind of an enriched case study. would celebrate that work. That hasn't yet happened. If I get the time to breathe, it might happen. But what became clear was that there's a hugely rich narrative from within the 10 institutes and centres that with whom we talked about research engaged teaching. So that kind of fusion of research and teaching, about their engagement with postgraduate research students who are doing work in this area that might be in relation to kind of blackness or white privilege, or the experiences of particular kind of communities, for instance. And also those are the things that I've mentioned that are also refable. So we were thinking about developing a decolonising research network as well of interested parties who might move this agenda forward. The development of the self-audit tool, which I'll talk to you about in a second. Thinking about how as an institution we might respond to UKRI priorities and how this work might feed into that, but in a way that where the methodological richness that comes out from our research work and research centres could be expressed inside bids and also be regarded as of value, efficient, able to deliver all of the things that those bids demand. And how one of the interesting things, I guess, kind of thinking about how we might link decolonising with issues around net zero, for instance, or decarbonising, how those might play off each other. In particular for universities or institutions in the global north that are reliant on engagement with communities in the global south, for instance. And finally, and this came from some work with research students in particular, a need or a desire for more work around decolonising methodologies and theories. So around issues around positionality, which we'll talk about in a little more detail when Lucy's got her voice back. Issues also in relation to field work, in relation to the purity of truth, of evidence-based practice, what that might mean. And around issues, I guess, in relation to kind of subjectivity and objectivity in the creation of knowledge and the relationship between those. Okay, so just going to go to the self-audit tool. So the work on the self-audit tool is important. It was requested by research centres. Actually, it didn't come from the project. It was requested by our Centre for Reproductive Research, who had already done some work on this, and were also thinking about this in relation to issues in relation to gender, I guess. They were thinking of running some dedicated webinars, which they did during one of the lockdowns. I forget which one, and that was really well attended, including with externals. They had requested the development of a self-audit tool for them to assess their involvement and engagement with decolonising and the processes. Not for us to grab those data and run away with them and to judge them, but for them to effectively have some prompts for thinking about the work they might be able to engage with and who they might need to speak with around that. Part of that being a consideration of the relationship between academics with a range of privilege inside the university. So it could be professors, associate professors, could be research fellows, but working closely with, in particular, PGR students. So that was seen to be fundamental. So it was developed in particular by thinking about the main responsibilities and duties of centres and institutes. So what were their priorities, I guess, in particular in relation to kind of outputs, impact, environment broadly constructed, and also thinking about how those activities relate to wider institutional conversations around research, around decolonising. This is where there might be an intersection with some of our research themes, for instance. So peace, social justice, strong institutions being one, net zero being another, but also thinking about issues in relation potentially to kind of digital and the role of the digital in this and who has access. What do digital structures and cultures and practices look like, and who gets marginalized within those spaces, who is included? Is there possibility for transparency and sharing within that space that enables certain stakeholder groups to have a voice in process? So trying to think about those activities in relationship to the broader institution. And as this final bullet point makes clear, it is to be used by whomever, institutes, centres, individuals, not by me. I haven't got time. I've got more than enough work to do than coming around and monitoring other people. But for people to evaluate their engagement or identify areas for development, or areas they hadn't previously thought about, or areas in which, in order to support potentially a ref submission in 28, they might want to, assuming there is one in 28, they would want to develop towards. So the self-audit tool itself has statements around these, or questions or prompts around these criteria, around these headings, around these kind of concepts within the I guess, which broadly fall within the kind of activities of a research centre or institute or project. Now, the audit tool itself was taken by, I guess, some of the prompts and some of the structure and some of the rationale was taken by work that had been conducted in relation to undergraduate work at SOAS, Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, but also from places like Kiel that had done quite a lot of work in relation to kind of decolonising as well. So we couldn't see a similar self-audit tool across the sector at the time in relation to research, but we knew there were self-audit tools that had been created by academics of colour, white academics engaged in this kind of anti-racist work. And so we didn't plagiarize, but we used them as prompts for the work that we were trying to do. So it starts with very deliberately position statements, and this will be the focus of the kind of next little section when I finally shut up, which will be upon your position in relation to this, in relation to your own research and your own work and your own values, and how are they centered then within your scholarly practice. So the position statement, which could be for an individual, but could be for a centre, but if it's going to be for a centre or an institute, and the one that I direct has 60 people in it, trying to get a statement might be problematic. So there's some questions to think about in that space around a sense of I and me and why. The focus then moves to research outputs, and effectively getting people to think about what have we got already and what's our direction of travel. So in community criminology, education and social justice, where I direct, we're thinking now about intersections between, for instance, decolonising, the experiences of Black and ethnically minoritized communities and institutions, and trying to think about that as well with gendered layer, because there's quite a lot of gendered work that's kind of going on within that institute. So it's trying to get a direction of travel for research that we can then think about in relation to impact and community engagement. We're also focused on funding and PGR work, talks and seminars and reading groups as well, which are super important because we're thinking about how we relate to each other in those spaces. They're face-to-face, they're relational, they're about people interacting, they're about dignity, they're about voice in that space, which is at the heart of the work that we've been trying to do, I think, and is at the heart of the working draft position that we have. Then we're thinking about knowledge transfer and exchange, and also research ethics. And within this, we are mindful that we work within an institution that has to drive efficiencies and value, that is governed by an Office for Students requirement to generate value for money, that exists in a competitive ecosystem, and where it is partnered with a range of other groups, which might be public sector bodies, might be charities, might be community groups, for instance, or user groups in relation to research, but might also be finance capital and hedge funds. And it might also involve working with vulnerable groups, for instance, in the global south. So we have to think about we have to think pragmatically about that. You know, it's a kind of, we have a strong set of views that we might have to hold lightly and know that they ebb and flow within the use of the tool. So I think, Lucy, that's probably me there. We're stopping for questions. We're stopping for questions. Are there any?
There aren't any in the chat at the moment.
That's nice. I like no questions on a Friday. Any in the room? No? Okay.
What I also wanted to maybe take the opportunity very quickly to, if we
go back?
I was going to stop presenting for a second, and I was going to answer Siobhan's question and share our self-audit tool. And it'll just take me a second to do that, but I can share it in the chat so that everyone can get access. Right, so let me just fiddle for a second, guys, and please do feel free to have a think about if you have any more questions, which you might be able to see on my phone there, Richard, if any questions do come up.
Do you want to share it and just on screen and just click through it and show it?
I can do that, yeah. Do you mind talking through it?
I'll talk.
I'm not sure how much I can.
I'll talk. I'm going to make you talk. Keep talking.
Here we are. So I'm hoping I can then share. There we go.
So this is the tool itself. Partnered with Kate, has some overview. So just a little bit of overview. It's not in as much kind of, I guess, practical or theoretical depth as the working position, but I see it kind of working hand in hand because they both talk about the creation of ways of knowing the world. They're about ways that, rather than necessarily formal knowledge production that can be commodified and resold and transferred and all of those things, it talks about deliberately about kind of ways of knowing the world, which map across to some of the work that happens in indigenous communities or in communities that are focused upon decolonizing or decoloniality as a process. So there's some support there in particular for around the heading. So some prompts around position statements, which we'll talk about in a second. So for instance, I'm just asking you very simply, would you benefit from one? Would members benefit from that? Do you already have a position statement in relation to, for instance, anti-racism and how complaints might be made or elevated in relation to what you're doing? Some stuff here on outputs, impact community engagement, PGR, funding bids, the kind of structure then around kind of outputs, impact and environment, I guess. So that is kind of how it looks. It's a series of prompts and questions in relation to all of those kind of areas. It's not final. It's in process. It's always in draft. It is purely designed to ask some very functional questions. Which might be around, say, talks and seminars, which here focus upon just the nature of who you're inviting. Are you considering who you're inviting? Are you considering the voices, the topics that you're covering in those spaces? Is there some dedicated work that might be done? So the International Centre for Sports History and Culture were doing some work that was that had a decolonising strand. So, for instance, there was a great talk on development of athletes in China under Mao, and what could be learned from that space. Also, I guess there's some stuff that we would usually expect to see because it's about decolonising reading lists or decolonising our approach to kind of resources, which feels kind of a little easier potentially than thinking about, I don't know, relationships. because a lot of the kind of the work of decolonising that's within the self-auditing tool sits in relation to the kind of relationships that exist within teams, relationships that exist within supervisory teams, for instance, thinking about issues of voice, and then it becomes kind of quite difficult, I guess, in relation to where with this final section that we've got on responsible research and innovation and research ethics. We've deliberately included the RRI stuff because we had some very rich conversations with the Centre for Computing and Social Responsibility about their ongoing and historic and material kind of work that they've been doing, in particular in communities in the Global South. So we were asking here, and also actually with energy and sustainable development around that as well. So the questions there being around how a lens of decoloniality impacts your work with low middle income countries and in post-colonial contexts, because there might be very different, I guess, kind of structures and cultures that have emerged there very recently and that are trying to find their way, against which we are overlaying methodologies and ways of working and structures on funding regimes and a desire for impact and knowledge transfer and spillover from funding councils in the UK or in the global north. So what are those relationships around, and what does that mean then for access to data? What do methodological approaches look like if we're working with Indigenous communities that have a different approach or idea to the role of the self in community, for instance? So how do we approach that within the constraints of research ethics that want to think about data protection, data governance, they want to think about GDPR, they want to think about data management, storage, all of these things, which are very highly predicated upon the individual in the research process. So how do we think about that then, and how do we get research ethics committees and reviewers to think about their approach to research ethics and the relationships in the research ethics process, rather than imposing a process that's been externally agreed? So it's those sorts of, I guess it's those sorts of questions that we've been asking within the context of it. And please, if it's not set in stone, and I do not regard myself as being the expert in this space, it's a set of prompts for research centres and institutes to think about or whoever to think about their practice and their culture and their structure and their relationships. And if you have if some of this makes no sense, or if some of this you want amending, then you let us know, and we're very happy to open up the conversation.
Siobhan has asked in the chat if we have had any feedback on the toolkit already, if it's been used by any centres.
To my knowledge, because we haven't audited the audit, we haven't audited the self-audit sort of mechanism. No one's come back to me, but if I'm brutally honest with you, we set up the network, or we had a couple of network meetings. We talked about it there. We then had a steering group. We tried to create a steering group, and then my workload got so much that I couldn't drive it forward anymore. So it's a kind of watch this space. I think this session is a trigger. I apologise, Siobhan, I couldn't tell you. I can ask. All right.
Siobhan says thank you.
You're very welcome.
So we will move on to
A little activity around positionality. So I'm going to just stop sharing again there for a second and take us back to our presentation. I will share the, Siobhan has very helpfully, thank you Siobhan, shared the version of the toolkit that we originally shared on the Decol website, and I will share the toolkit branded version that's much shinier and prettier, and I'll pop that in the chat in a moment. I'm going to take us back to our slideshow. Here we go, and on to an activity for us to have a go at. Now, those of you calling in, you'll be pleased to know this is an activity that you can also easily engage with wherever you are. So you feel free to stay with us. And probably laugh as I lose my voice more and more over the next 10 minutes. We're going to talk a bit about positionality, that first part of the self-audit tool. So positionality, a researcher's positionality, is very much an act of reflexivity and considering who we are as a researcher and where we sit in relation to the work that we're doing. The consideration of positionality is quite common, I think, in kind of postgrad work, because you're expected to be very clear about how you've come upon the work that you've done, but maybe not something that we are encouraged as much to engage in as researchers kind of later on in our careers. And it can be useful to come back and think again about where we position ourselves. So when we begin to consider our positionality, we are initially at least asking ourselves three key questions. What we believe to be the nature of reality, how we go about knowing something, and how we go about discovering more knowledge. So the ontological question, the epistemological question, and the methodological question. But I prefer the more normal person way of asking them. So thinking about, whether we view reality as subjective or objective, thinking about the ways in which we know things, and then thinking about the ways in which, as researchers, we go out to explore and the methodologies that we use in order to develop more knowledge. So positionality helps us to distinguish where a researcher is coming from, their philosophical standpoint, their view of the world, and how their position has influenced their worldview and therefore their work and their research. So it can be really useful as someone outside of a piece of research to be able to see that consideration from a fellow researcher, because it can help you to understand how they've come about their findings and their position on the research that they've conducted. And I keep clicking on the other page, and there we go. When we consider that further from through an anti-racist decolonising lens, we can then also start to think about the social and political context that creates our identity, and start to drill deeper into who we are as an individual and how our identity then influences and potentially biases our views of the world. Which obviously, for myself, as a white woman working in decolonising and anti-racist practice, has been very useful, and it's been something that's been a constant process for me as a researcher, and I know for Richard as well, in the work that we do, collecting the experiences and the views of people from a range of backgrounds that we can't always necessarily fully appreciate as white individuals, and trying to find ways to develop theory and generate messages from those conversations that do justice to the experiences of people from different backgrounds to our own. So that's been really key for us throughout working on the Decol project. So engaging reflexively takes time, which is why the activity we're going to do today is not for you to write a position statement, because that would go very much against what I'm saying right now, that it takes time. We're going to do a bit of a mind map just to kind of get some initial ideas down that you can then take away and potentially develop into a positionality statement if you choose to do so. And it's also really important to remember that it's a really fluid process and it can change with each project. So before I came and joined the project, my PhD was on educational technology, and so I am very happy to admit that my race hadn't really come into my consideration of myself as a researcher before then. It hadn't been highlighted in the same way that it is in the work that I do now, and so that has become much more a part of who I am as a researcher now, and my consideration of that with this research project than with research that I've done previously. So it's remembering to come back to this and continue to be reflexive as a constant process, and thinking about where we sit in relation to our work. And it's also, as I said, important to then locate ourselves in relation to our work. So thinking about the subject that we're investigating, what our personal relationship is with that subject, and what influence that might have on our view of the work that we conduct. Our participants, the people that we're working with. So again, using myself as an example, I have to think about how I can create a safe space for the people that I speak with as a white woman, to ensure that I am supportive of the conversation that we're having, to create a safe space for them so that we can have a full exchange. And that's something that I have to be very mindful of. And then also the research process and the context. So not just the broader subject, but also the specific settings in which the phenomenon that you're investigating take place. So we have a list of questions here just to kind of spark some ideas. And I am going to share my own little mind map that I did at home around these. So I think we will take 10 minutes for people to have a work through some of the questions. And the chat is still open, so we can see if you have any questions. So just have a go. So I will show you very quickly, I just jotted down answers to the questions, and then it's an object. Don't worry, Kay, I brought pens and paper. Of course I did. And then it's more about then taking this. So these are the answers to some of these questions, and then start to think about how they link together. And it's then thinking about how the relationship between these answers is then how we can start to move towards developing a positionality statement of our own. So we will take 10 minutes. I'll leave the slide up so that those of you calling in can see, and